He lifted his glass and said, "To our last holiday with her," and the room burst into polite laughter. I sat right there, close enough to see the reflection of the Christmas lights trembling in his wine. No one looked at me, not even my son, not even Daniel. It's a strange thing to be erased while still breathing, still hearing, still holding the fork in your hand, as if you were part of the table. I remember thinking that if I blinked too loudly, someone might accuse me of ruining the mood. Sophie touched his arm and whispered something that made him smile. I watched that smile the way a person watches ice crack under their own feet, quietly, because reacting would only make the fall faster. "Next year will be different," he added softly, as if the walls were the only ones meant to hear. But I heard. At 74, my hearing is the only thing no one tries to take from me. I cut a small piece of ham, though my hands felt stiff. Across the table, my granddaughter Clara was the only one avoiding the laughter. Her eyes darted toward me, wide and uncertain, as if she knew something and wished she didn't. I gave her a small nod, the kind that says, "Don't fuss over me, darling." I've survived worse storms than this one. The tree in the corner flickered, the way cheap lights do, and I wondered whether Daniel had meant for the flicker to distract from the cruelty in his voice. Probably not. Cruelty, when practiced long enough, becomes thoughtless. They were all so comfortable. Sophie passing plates, Daniel topping off glasses, his friends chatting as though my presence was some seasonal decoration they'd outgrown but hadn't yet bothered to throw out. I looked at my hands. They used to be strong enough to lift my husband when his knees gave out in the last months. They used to scrub floors, stitch torn jackets, hold Daniel's feverish head when he was a boy who couldn't sleep without pressing his cheek against my shoulder. Those hands weren't trembling now. I was surprised by that. I kept waiting for the shaking, the heat behind the eyes, the sting of humiliation. Instead, there was a calmness, thin but solid, like the first layer of ice on a winter pond. Sophie's brother asked Daniel if the plan was still set for January. Daniel nodded quickly, too quickly, and took a sip of wine. A secret between men, spoken openly because the woman it concerned wasn't considered capable of understanding. I felt something inside me shift. Not break, not snap, just shift. A small internal click, like a lock turning in a long unused door. When dessert came, a cranberry pie I used to bake myself before Sophie decided her recipe was more refined, I tasted nothing. The voices blurred together, pleasant and distant. And still, no one looked at me. It wasn't until the plates were being cleared that Daniel finally met my eyes. A brief glance, almost accidental. I didn't smile. I didn't lower my gaze. I simply looked back, quietly, steadily, the way you look at a stranger who has forgotten he was once your child. On the drive home, the night was sharp with cold, the kind that makes every breath feel like a question. I turned off the radio and let the silence settle. His words replayed, not echoing, not tormenting, just existing, like a lantern held up to show a path I'd ignored for too long. To our last holiday with her. He said it so easily, and I finally understood. They had made plans for my life without me. And for the first time in many years, I felt something close to clarity. When I closed the door behind me, the house didn't greet me. Houses used to do that, you know, at least when someone you loved still lived in them. Now mine stayed quiet, like a room holding its breath. I set my gloves on the table, a little clumsily, and stood there for a moment, letting the warmth of the hallway seep into my fingers. Funny how the cold finds its way into places you thought were protected. I hung my coat on the hook Daniel made for me when he was 11. It leaned a little to the left, the way it always had, because he insisted on hammering every nail himself. I used to love that crookedness, proof that he tried, that he cared enough to make something for me with his own hands. Tonight, it felt like a reminder that nothing stays straight, not even the things we build with love. The living room lamp flickered when I turned it on, not unlike the Christmas tree lights at Daniel's house. I wondered if that was the way life aged, quiet, flickering, still holding on, but dimmer than before. I sank into the armchair, the cushions soft from years of being leaned into after long days. My husband had died in that chair. Not literally, but in the days before the end, he spent hours there, watching the window as if waiting for something he couldn't name. He used to tell me, "Ellie, don't let people rearrange your life without asking you." I remember laughing at him then, telling him no one would dare do such a thing. I was younger, softer, and more foolish. I thought motherhood meant safety. I thought love guaranteed respect. Tonight showed me how naive that was. I took off my shoes and pushed them aside with my foot. My legs ached. I'd been on them all day, helping Sophie baste the turkey because she said the kitchen stressed her out. I've learned over the years that when a younger woman says she's stressed, what she means is that an older woman is about to do the work. I didn't mind, or at least I told myself I didn't. Back then it felt like participation, like belonging. Now it felt more like service. My eyes drifted to the window. The neighbors' Christmas lights were still on, a soft blue glow that shimmered on the frost. I used to think nights like these were gentle. Tonight they felt hollow. I tried to picture next year, as Daniel had said, next year will be different. What version of different were they building without me? A facility with beige walls and scheduled meal times? A polite explanation to friends about how it was for the best? Or perhaps they simply wanted to celebrate without the burden of an aging mother who didn't fit their curated lives. I wasn't angry. Anger is too sharp, too hot. What I felt was something rounder, heavier, almost still, like a stone resting at the bottom of a lake. A kind of grief, but not the kind that comes from losing someone. It was the grief of realizing someone has already lost you, silently, piece by piece, while smiling across the table as though nothing had changed. I got up slowly and went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. The steam rose in thin threads, curling upward like small questions. Clara's face came back to me then, her quick, worried glance across the holiday table. Children always know when something is wrong. They sense the fractures adults pretend aren't there. I wondered what she'd been told, what she feared, what she wished she could say out loud. The whistle of the kettle startled me. My hands wrapped around the cup, grateful for the heat. I brought it with me back to the armchair and sat again, breathing in the faint scent of chamomile. My husband used to say the house sounded differently when I was upset, like the walls stiffened. Perhaps they did now, listening to me breathe, listening to the thoughts I'd never spoken aloud. I didn't cry. Tears require shock, and I wasn't shocked anymore. Somewhere inside me, I had known, maybe for years, that Daniel's love had thinned, stretched too far over the demands of his new life. I had ignored 100 small signs, the way a woman ignores the first cracks in her favorite porcelain cup, hoping it will hold just a little longer. But hope is not the same as truth. I sipped my tea, tasting nothing, and set the cup down. The night outside deepened. The frost thickened. And somewhere in the quiet, I heard my husband's voice again, not as memory, but as understanding. Don't let them decide your ending, Ellie. It wasn't a warning. It was a reminder, and I sat there in the dim light, letting that reminder settle into me, slow and steady as breath. Clara called the next afternoon, her voice soft in that way young people use when they're afraid the truth might bruise someone. I was folding laundry at the kitchen table, the way I always do when I need to keep my hands steady. The phone vibrated, and her name lit up the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it ring, not because I didn't want to hear her, but because I wasn't sure I could keep my voice from betraying something I hadn't yet named. "Grandma?" she said, barely above a whisper. "Can you talk?" I told her yes, though my throat felt thick. She hesitated, long enough for me to hear the quiet tapping of her fingernail against the phone. She used to do that as a child when she was nervous before school recitals. "I just wanted to check on you," she began. "Last night was weird. Weird. Children soften everything. If she had been my age, she would have called it what it was, cruel. But Clara was 16, and 16-year-olds still believe families don't fracture unless someone slams a door." I didn't correct her. I simply said, "Yes, dear, it was." She inhaled sharply. I heard Dad and Sophie talking in the kitchen before dinner. I wasn't trying to overhear anything, I swear. I was looking for cinnamon for the cider and they didn't notice me. My fingers froze around the towel I'd been folding. I didn't breathe. I just listened. "They were talking about January," Clara said faintly. "About you, moving, about how it needs to be done before something happens, and how they'll handle the paperwork. Dad said he didn't want to tell you yet because you'd make it emotional." Her voice tightened. "He said you'd make things complicated." I closed my eyes for a moment. It was strange, the way grief could be so quiet, so still, that even a child's voice felt loud against it. I didn't feel surprised. Not anymore. But hearing it spoken aloud by someone who loved me, someone not yet hardened by adult logic, made the truth sit heavier. "Did they say where?" I asked. "A place called Maple Hills Assisted Living," she whispered, as if naming it made it real. "They said it's perfectly adequate and that you don't need more than that. And they said you shouldn't be living alone anymore, not with the stairs, not after—" She trailed off. "After what, sweetheart?" Silence. Then, "After Grandpa died." As if grief were a weakness. As if widowhood were a diagnosis. As if my life since then had been some sort of ticking time bomb they were waiting to confiscate before it inconvenienced them. I sat down carefully, the chair cool beneath me. "Thank you for telling me, Clara. I didn't mean to spy," she said quickly. "It just didn't feel right, the way they talked about it. Like it was already decided." Her voice cracked on the last two words. Already decided. I felt something in me settle, not in defeat, but in recognition. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a slip of the tongue at dinner. It was a plan, crafted in soft voices behind closed doors, dressed in the language of concern but rooted in something far smaller. "Grandma?" she said after a while. "Are you upset?" I considered my answer carefully. I didn't want to put the weight of my pain on her shoulders, those young shoulders that were still learning how to hold themselves. But I also refused to lie, not anymore. Not after last night. "I'm not upset with you, darling," I said. "You did the right thing. You told the truth. But they should have told you, she insisted. They should have talked to you first. You're not, you're not some problem to solve. Her voice wavered, and for the first time that day, a warmth rose in my chest that wasn't tied to hurt. Thank you, I whispered. That means more than you know. We spoke for another few minutes. Safe, ordinary things about school, about her art project, about how her best friend had dyed her hair blue and regretted it immediately. I let her talk. I let normalcy steady us both. When she finally hung up, promising to see me soon, the house fell quiet again. I looked at the neatly folded towels, stacked like little white decisions on the table. Clara's words echoed through the room, filling the empty spaces the way truth tends to when you finally stop pushing it aside. Already decided. The kettle clicked off behind me, though I hadn't remembered turning it on. The house didn't feel silent anymore. It felt awake, listening. So was I. The next morning I woke earlier than usual. Not because I'd slept well, sleep had come in fragments thin as tissue, but because something in me felt unsettled, like a drawer left slightly open. I made tea, buttered a piece of toast I barely touched, and tried to pretend that today was an ordinary day. At my age, ordinariness is a kind of prayer. But the quiet in the house felt different, expectant, as if it knew there were answers waiting to be found. I went to the hall closet, meaning only to look for an old scarf. Instead, my eyes landed on a familiar cardboard box on the top shelf, the one Daniel brought over 2 weeks ago. He'd said it was just paperwork he needed to sort through when he had time. I remember asking if it was safe to keep here. Of course, he'd said, barely glancing at me. You don't mind holding it for a bit, do you? I never mind, I had said. A mother rarely does. But now Clara's words echoed through me, and suddenly the box didn't feel harmless at all. I reached up slowly, steadying myself with the doorframe, and pulled it down. It wasn't heavy, just full enough to make a soft shifting sound, a sound like envelopes and folders brushing against each other. My fingers hesitated for a moment on the lid. It felt like trespassing, even though it sat in my home. But then I remembered the whispered plans, the clink of glasses, Daniel's careless toast. If they were planning my future, I was entitled to know what kind of future that was. Inside the box were neatly stacked documents in color-coded folders, blue, green, and a single red one. Daniel had never been organized as a child. Sophie must have put this together. She liked categories, structure, things that behaved neatly. People, too. I opened the blue folder first. Financial statements, printouts of my accounts, balances, long columns of numbers I recognized all too well. Some pages were circled in yellow highlighter. Others had notes scribbled in the margins in Sophie's curved handwriting. Ask her about this? And should consolidate? I felt a flush rise to my cheeks. They'd been studying my finances, quietly, carefully, like investigators mapping out a case. I wondered how long they'd been doing it. The green folder held brochures, glossy and smiling, images of elderly people sitting in pastel-colored lounges, playing board games, doing chair yoga. Maple Hills Assisted Living. Sunnyside Community Care. Rolling Pines Residential. Each one promised safety, peace of mind, full support for your loved one. The language of disposal softened into kindness. At the bottom lay an intake form with blanks filled in: my birthday, my medical history, emergency contacts, allergies. It was my handwriting in none of the spaces. I placed the papers down gently. It's odd how betrayal doesn't always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it comes printed on high-quality brochure paper with kind fonts and staged photographs. The red folder I left for last. Red is always for something final. Taxes, legal warnings, endings. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside were emails printed out and clipped together. I read the first page. Regarding Mrs. Marsh's potential transition timeline. I blinked. Transition. Such a polite word for erasure. We can secure a room as early as mid-January, pending family approval of the payment plan. Below that, Sophie's printed reply. We agree mid-January would be ideal. We will handle the conversation with her. She tends to be emotional, so we'd prefer minimal involvement on your end. Emotional. How convenient that a woman's pain can be mislabeled until it becomes a justification. Another page. Daniel, please confirm whether your mother will bring her personal funds or if you'll require a temporary family payment arrangement until her accounts are accessible. Accessible. That word stayed with me longer than any other. I sat at the kitchen table. The documents spread out before me like pieces of a puzzle I'd been assembling unconsciously for years. All the little moments, the dismissive comments, the tightened smiles, the sudden interest in my medications, the advice about downsizing, the way Daniel handled my mail as if he were doing me a favor. Each one slid into place. They'd been preparing for this quietly, slowly, certain of my compliance. I swallowed, feeling the familiar ache in my throat, but the tears didn't come. They weren't needed. What I felt wasn't sorrow, it was understanding. A clear, steady understanding that arrived with the calmness of winter light. I gathered the papers back into their folders, smoothing each one carefully, as though even betrayal deserved to be treated gently. I put them back in the box and set it on the table. Then I made fresh tea, stronger this time. My hands no longer trembled. If they had planned so much without me, then I too would have to plan. Only differently, quietly, with the same patience they thought belonged to their advantage. The kettle hissed, and I poured the water slowly, letting the sound fill the kitchen. I wasn't emotional. I was awake. I left the box on the kitchen table and walked into the living room, needing space between myself and those folders. The house held its usual stillness, but something in the air felt heavier, as if all the years I had lived here had gathered together to remind me of who I used to be. I sat down slowly, folding my hands in my lap, and let the memories come, not as scenes, not like the movies people imagine older women replay in their heads, but as quiet truths layered inside every object around me. Daniel's childhood drawings still hung in the hallway, though the colors had faded. One of them, crayoned blue and crooked, was of our old house before we moved here. He'd drawn me standing in the yard with a smile so wide it barely fit on the page. I remember how proud he'd been, thrusting the paper at me, cheeks flushed. "It's you, Mama," he'd said. "You're happy." I hadn't been able to tell him then that happiness felt like something I had to earn every day, through work, through sacrifice, through patience that stretched far beyond what my own mother ever had for me. I just kissed his forehead and put the drawing on the fridge. When he was 9, his father lost his job, and I took extra shifts at the medical supply warehouse. I'd come home with aching feet and the metallic smell of latex gloves clinging to my clothes. Still, I cooked. I helped with homework. I sat beside him until he drifted to sleep. When he had pneumonia at 14, I slept in a chair by his bed for a week. I didn't leave the room except to wash my face and change my shirt. Later, when college came, we sold my husband's fishing boat to cover Daniel's last semester. "I'll pay you back," he'd said, but I never asked. A mother doesn't think of help as debt. She thinks of it as duty, stitched into the fabric of her life so tightly, she sometimes forgets it wasn't supposed to be a one-way thread. I looked at the mantelpiece. Photos of graduations, birthdays, snapshots of Daniel holding Clara as a baby. In every picture, I was there too, somewhere in the background, smiling. Sometimes holding a tray of food, sometimes standing just off to the side. Always near enough to support, never close enough to be seen. There were other moments too, buried deeper. The phone call when he and Sophie announced they were buying their first house, how they'd asked if I could help with the down payment, just until taxes come in. The car repair they insisted was an emergency. The time they needed childcare for 3 weeks while Sophie trained for her new job. Every request came wrapped in urgency, but never in gratitude. I told myself it didn't matter, that helping them was simply part of growing old. But now, looking at those folders, I realized all those years of giving had turned into expectation. Not love, not respect, expectation. My husband used to say, "Ellie, generosity is only noble if it's seen as a gift. If they treat it like a right, it becomes servitude." I used to laugh, thinking he was exaggerating, but now his words pressed against me, slow and heavy, like thawing ice sliding off a roof. I walked to the bookshelf and touched the spine of his favorite novel. The page edges had curled from years of being read and reread. He had lived with such quiet integrity. He paid back every borrowed tool, thanked every kindness twice, believed that respect was the simplest form of love. If he were here, he would have seen the signs earlier. He always did. My eyes moved to the picture of us on our 33rd anniversary. He had his arm around me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, not possessive, just sure. That certainty, the knowledge that I was wanted beside him, is something I hadn't felt in a long time. And perhaps that was the hardest truth of all. Somewhere along the years, Daniel stopped wanting me beside him. He wanted what I could give, what I could carry, what I could soften or solve. But not me, not my presence, not my voice, not even my company on Christmas Eve. I sat back down, letting a long breath settle in my chest. The papers in the kitchen weren't just documents. They were evidence of a story I hadn't realized I was living. A story in which I was no longer a character, only a responsibility being transferred from one folder to another. But I was not a folder. I was not a line item. I was not a decision made in whispers. I was Eleanor Marsh, wife, mother, grandmother, worker, woman. A woman who had loved deeply, given freely, endured quietly. And now, finally, a woman who saw the truth without blinking. The room felt different as I stood up, not brighter, not warmer, but clearer, as if the house itself understood that something in me had shifted. Not broken, shifted. I walked back toward the kitchen, toward the box, toward whatever would come next. I didn't plan to go to the bank that morning. I hadn't planned anything at all. But when I woke, the decision was already there, quiet and solid, like a chair someone had placed beside my bed during the night. I dressed slowly, choosing my heavier coat because the wind had a sharp bite to it. At 74, you learn to respect the cold. It punishes arrogance. The box still sat on the kitchen table where I'd left it. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. The truth inside it had already settled into me, pressed into my bones the way winter air presses into old window frames. I poured myself a cup of coffee, drank half of it, and then set the mug down with a steadiness that surprised me. I wasn't trembling. Rage shakes. Fear shakes. But clarity is still. When I stepped outside, the sky was a pale, uncommitted gray, the sort that never decides whether to snow or simply brood. My boots crunched softly on the frost as I walked to the bus stop. I could have called a car, but I wanted the time between here and the bank. Time to think without thinking, to let my mind settle the way snow settles on an untouched lawn. There were only two other passengers. A young mother with a toddler bundled like a small astronaut, and an older man who nodded at me in that polite way of people who recognize their own age in someone else's posture. I nodded back. He didn't know it, but the gesture helped steady me. When I reached the bank, the warmth inside hit me in a wave, too strong, almost artificial. The young receptionist greeted me with practiced brightness. "Good morning, Mrs. Marsh. How can we help you today?" I'd forgotten how small-town banks treat longtime customers like local relics, fragile, harmless, incapable of surprise. "I'd like to speak with someone about my accounts," I said. She blinked, still smiling. "Of course. Is this about the monthly transfers?" "Yes," I said. "Those." A few minutes later, I was sitting across from a man named Patrick. He was maybe in his early 30s, with the sort of kind eyes people mistake for genuine understanding. He folded his hands neatly, ready to guide me through whatever simple confusion he assumed I had. "How can I help today, Mrs. Marsh?" I took a breath. "I'd like to cancel all recurring transfers, every single one." His eyebrows rose slightly. "All?" He clicked through the list on his screen. "You have quite a few scheduled. Some have been active for years." "Yes," I said gently. "That's why I want them stopped." He hesitated, trying to choose the right tone. "If I may ask, has there been a change in your financial situation?" "In a way," I replied. "Not the kind you mean." He waited, but I didn't elaborate. Some truths belong to those who live them, not to strangers paid to nod sympathetically. He cleared his throat. "Well, of course we can process that. I just need to confirm that you understand the impact. Some of these transfers cover loans, insurance policies, tuition." "I understand," I said. "Cancel them." His fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Immediately?" "Yes, immediately." There was something almost reverent about the way he pressed the final key, as though he sensed that an unseen chord had snapped. Behind his polite professionalism, I thought I glimpsed a flicker of respect. Not everyone has the courage to sever what has held them for so long. I signed a small stack of papers, my name steady in each signature. Eleanor Marsh. The letters flowed easily, like a river remembering its own shape. When we were finished, Patrick walked me to the front desk. "If you need any assistance in the future," he said, "we're always here." I nodded. "Thank you." Outside, the wind had picked up, but it didn't feel cruel. More like a reminder that the world kept moving, whether or not people paid attention. On the bus ride home, I watched the town pass by. The grocery store where Daniel had clung to my coat at age 5. The pharmacy where I'd bought Sophie prenatal vitamins when she was too sick to drive. The park where Clara learned to ride her bike before her parents decided they were too busy to take her. Memories everywhere, layered like old paint. But none of them hurt the way they might have yesterday. Maybe because I finally understood something I should have learned long ago. Love is not proven by sacrifice alone. It must also be received with care. When I walked back into my house, the air felt warmer, less heavy. as if some long-held breath had finally been released. I hung my coat, sat at the kitchen table, and looked at the box of documents. The papers inside no longer frightened me, because now I knew they weren't the end of my story, only the end of letting someone else write it. The first sign that something had shifted came that evening, just after sunset. The house had settled into its usual winter quiet, the kind that sits gently around the edges of a lamp's glow. I was knitting by the window, not because I needed a scarf, but because the steady rhythm kept my thoughts from tightening too much. The phone buzzed once on the table, then again, and again. At first I ignored it. For years the phone had been an instrument of requests, not conversation. But after the fourth vibration, I glanced over. 3 missed calls from Daniel, 1 from Sophie, a text from an unfamiliar number that turned out to be Clara's school. Payment unsuccessful. Please update billing information. I stared at it for a moment, the needles still in my lap. So the bank had done its work quickly. A strange calm washed over me, not satisfaction, not triumph. Something simpler. Acknowledgement. The way a body feels when it finally stops carrying a weight it should have set down long ago. The phone buzzed again. This time I let it ring. Daniel's name lit the screen, pulsing with each vibration. I didn't move to answer. The room felt too still, too honest for a conversation filled with urgency he hadn't shown before today. After the ringing stopped, a text appeared. "Mom, something's wrong. The mortgage didn't go through. Did you switch banks or something?" I exhaled slowly, knitting yarn falling loosely between my fingers. Mortgage. I remembered the day I signed that first check, the excitement in his eyes, the gratitude he expressed so quickly it felt rehearsed even then. I had told myself it was joy. Now I wasn't so sure. Another message came. "Mom, please call me. This looks serious." Serious. Only now. Not when they made plans about my life behind closed doors. Not when they discussed me like an obligation. Not even when he toasted to our last holiday with her. No, serious only meant financial. I set the knitting aside and stood, stretching my back. The ache there was familiar, almost comforting. When the body hurts, at least you know where the pain is coming from. As I walked into the kitchen, the phone buzzed again. Sophie this time. "Eleanor, hi. We think something went wrong with your bank. Could you please sort it out? It's causing a lot of issues on our end." Her messages always had that brittle brightness, like a hostess trying to hide chipped china. I made myself tea, letting the kettle whistle a moment longer than needed. The sharp sound cut through the quiet in a way that felt cleansing. By the time I sat down with my cup, 2 more messages had arrived. Daniel. The insurance payment bounced too. "Mom, this isn't like you. Are you okay?" Daniel, again. "Please answer." I took a sip of tea. Chamomile tonight. I needed something soft in my hands. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply done participating in a structure built on my silence. About an hour later, Clara called. Her name on the screen made my chest warm in a way the tea could not. I answered immediately. "Grandma, are you home?" Her voice held none of the frantic edge the others had, only worry, genuine and uncoded. "Dad's really stressed. Something about payments not going through. Are you okay?" I smiled softly, though she couldn't see it. "I'm quite all right, sweetheart." "You didn't lose your card or anything, did you? They're acting like something terrible happened." "Nothing terrible," I said gently. "Just some adjustments." She was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "Does this have to do with what I told you?" Bless the child. She was quicker than all of them. In a way, I answered. Sometimes, Clara, adults make decisions for so long that they forget they're allowed to make different ones. She breathed out, a small sound of understanding. I just wanted to check on you. That means more than you know. After we hung up, the house settled again. Only the hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the wall clock filled the room. A peaceful kind of ticking, steady and unhurried. At 9 o'clock, another message arrived. Daniel. Mom? The tuition payment for Clara didn't go through. They emailed us. We really need to talk. I ran my finger along the rim of my cup. Tuition. The one payment I never regretted. Clara worked hard, harder than most her age. But even that had become an expectation. Another line item buried under their assumption that I would always say yes. I walked to the window and looked outside. The street was empty except for a single porch light flickering across the road. Winter air pressed gently against the glass, cold but not unwelcome. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel lonely. It felt like breathing space. Another vibration from the phone. I didn't bother checking this one. I had already read the story they were trying to write. Tonight, the only story that mattered was the one I had begun writing for myself. Slowly, carefully, each decision a thread in a life I was reclaiming stitch by stitch. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad in front of me, though I wasn't writing anything yet. I'd always believed decisions should rest overnight before being acted upon, the way bread dough needs time to rise. But this decision hadn't wilted or softened while I slept. It had only settled more deeply, like a stone finding its place at the bottom of a river. I put on my coat, locked the door behind me, and walked slowly down the street toward the bus stop. My joints ached, but the ache was familiar, almost companionable. At my age, you learn to move with pain instead of against it. The law office was on Maple Street, in an old brick building that had once been a post office. The bell chimed softly as I stepped inside. Warm air wrapped around me, smelling faintly of paper and lemon polish. A young receptionist looked up with a bright smile, the kind reserved for clients who appear harmless. Good morning. Do you have an appointment? No, I said, but I need to speak with someone about my will and financial protections. Her smile didn't falter, but it stiffened just slightly. People assume that women my age come in confused or pressured by relatives. They rarely expect clarity. A few minutes later, I was led into a quiet office where a man in his late 50s rose from behind his desk. Mrs. Marsh, he said warmly, offering his hand. I'm Alan Whitmore. Please sit. I took the seat opposite him. The leather was cold at first, then softened beneath me. He folded his hands. How can I help you today? I reached into my handbag and placed the folded intake documents from the box onto his desk. Not all of them, just enough to speak without speaking too much. My son and daughter-in-law have been making plans about my future, I said calmly, without informing me. Alan's eyes sharpened, but he didn't interrupt. I want to revise my will, and I want to protect my assets. I'd also like to ensure no one can access my accounts or make decisions for me without my consent. His nod was slow, deliberate. You want autonomy secured, financially and legally. Yes, I said. Exactly. He opened a folder and began making notes. We can revoke any previous power of attorney, establish a new one if you choose, and structure a trust that distributes funds according to your terms, not family expectation. family expectation. Such a polite phrase for entitlement. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I'd like my granddaughter Clara to be the beneficiary of a separate trust, I said quietly. She's the only one who's shown concern without asking for anything. That can be arranged, he said. And your son? I paused. The question wasn't cruel. It was necessary. Still, the air felt thicker as I considered it. My son will receive what I choose, I said finally. Not what he assumes. Alan gave a small, approving nod, the kind men give when they recognize backbone in someone who has been underestimated. He explained each document carefully, not with the slow, patronizing tone many people use with seniors, but with respect. Real respect, the kind that listens. I asked questions. I clarified details. I made choices deliberately, not rushed by emotion. When he slid the forms toward me, my hand felt steady. Signing my name had never felt like an act of self-preservation before, but today, each loop of the pen felt like reclaiming a room in my own house. When everything was arranged, Alan stood and offered his hand again. You're doing the right thing, Mrs. Marsh. I'm doing the necessary thing, I corrected softly. Outside, the wind had picked up. My scarf fluttered against my coat, but I didn't fasten it right away. The cold on my throat felt bracing, almost refreshing. I waited for the bus with my documents pressed neatly in my handbag, the sky a pale winter blue overhead. On the ride home, I watched frost gather along the window's edge. The town passed by in familiar shapes: rooftops, bare branches, a woman walking a small dog who tugged eagerly at its leash. Ordinary life, continuing. But something inside me had shifted again, quietly but unmistakably. Not anger, not fear, just a deeper sense of self returning, inch by inch. I stepped off the bus and walked toward my house, the pavement crunching under my feet. Nothing around me had changed, but I had. Daniel showed up the next evening, long before I expected him. I heard the car door slam with more force than necessary, that old, familiar sign of his impatience. When he was a child, he used to stomp his feet the same way when things didn't go as he'd planned. Some habits age, but they don't disappear. I stayed seated at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of tea. The knock came. 3 sharp raps, not a breath between them. He wanted the door opened quickly. He wanted answers quickly. I took my time. When I finally opened it, Daniel stood there with a phone in one hand and a stack of mail in the other. His face was tight, cheeks flushed with frustration or embarrassment. I couldn't tell which. Maybe both. "Mom," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." He walked straight to the kitchen, as though the house were still his childhood home where he could come and go as he pleased. I followed at my own pace. He set his phone on the table, scrolling urgently. "Everything bounced," he said. "Everything. The mortgage, the insurance, Clara's tuition, the car payment. The bank says you canceled the transfers." "I did," I answered simply. He blinked, as if expecting more. "Why?" "Because they were no longer appropriate." The silence that followed had a shape to it. Wide, heavy, stretching between us like a frozen lake. "Mom," he said slowly, lowering himself into the chair across from me. "If you're confused or overwhelmed, you should have talked to us first." I almost laughed. Confused. Overwhelmed. The words people use with old women when what they really mean is difficult. "I'm neither confused nor overwhelmed," I replied. "I made a decision." He exhaled sharply. "But we rely on those payments." "Yes," I said. I know. His eyes narrowed slightly, not with cruelty, but with the dawning realization that the world might not be arranged the way he thought. Is this about Christmas Eve? About the toast? Sophie said it came out wrong. Did it? I asked softly. Or did it come out honestly? He shifted in his chair. His fingers tapped the phone, a nervous habit. We weren't excluding you, he insisted. It was just a joke. Poor wording. I looked at him, really looked, the way I hadn't allowed myself to in years. He was 46, tired around the eyes, handsome in a way that came from confidence rather than youth. And yet, in this moment, he looked like a boy caught in a lie he didn't know how to unravel. Daniel, I said, I know about Maple Hills. His face went still. A single blink, slow and deliberate. What? The brochures, the intake form, the emails. Color drained from his cheeks so quickly it almost startled me. Mom, listen. It's not what you think. We were only exploring options. You live alone. You fall asleep on the couch. What if something happens? And you plan to inform me when? He rubbed his forehead. When things settled. We didn't want to upset you. Upset me. As if hiding the shape of their plans would soften the impact of being removed from the life I built. You didn't want a discussion, I said. You wanted agreement. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. Not loud, not violent, but unmistakable. You're being dramatic. I let the words sit between us, untouched. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. We were trying to help you. You're 74. You shouldn't be managing everything alone. And yet, I replied, I seem to be managing just fine. He looked away, jaw tightening. We just need those payments reinstated. We're already behind. I know, I said, but they will remain canceled. His eyes snapped back to mine, wounded, bewildered. We're your family. I am aware. Don't you want to support us? I have supported you, I said gently, for decades, often at the expense of myself. I paused. But support without respect is servitude, and I am done serving. Daniel pushed back his chair and stood abruptly. For a moment, I thought he might leave without another word, the way he used to storm off as a teenager. But he didn't. He stood there, breathing hard, anger shadowing something much softer underneath. Mom, he said, voice tight, you're making a mistake. Perhaps, I replied, but it will be my mistake, not yours. He stared at me for a long moment, as if seeing me for the first time, not as the woman who filled in every gap of his life, but as someone who had quietly stepped out of his control. He picked up his phone, slipped it into his pocket, and walked toward the door. I'll call you later, he muttered. I didn't answer. I simply closed the door behind him, gently, without anger. The house settled into silence once more, a silence that felt, for the first time, like mine. Sophie arrived the next afternoon, which surprised me only slightly. She wasn't the type to leave unpleasant matters to unfold on their own. Daniel stormed. Sophie organized. I saw her through the window, stepping briskly out of her car, smoothing her coat, collecting herself the way people do before entering a room where they hope to win. I opened the door before she knocked. She blinked, startled for a moment, then composed herself. Eleanor, she said, her smile tight around the corners. We need to talk. I assumed as much, I replied, stepping aside. She walked in with the kind of purposeful stride one uses in boardrooms or staged kitchens during holidays, confident, rehearsed. She sat at the table, crossing her legs neatly, placing her purse beside her like a prop. "I'll be direct," she began. "Canceling those transfers caused significant stress for Daniel. For all of us. We're juggling too much right now to handle surprises like that." Her tone suggested that my choice was a misbehavior, a breach in the order she curated. I folded my hands in my lap. "I'm sorry for the stress," I said. "But the decision stands." She exhaled sharply. "Eleanor, you can't just cut us off financially without warning. It's irresponsible." That word, irresponsible. After years of doing everything they asked, quietly, reliably, she had the audacity to use that word. "Sophie," I said, "I'm not obligated to fund your household." She leaned forward, incredulous. "We're not asking you to fund us. These were shared commitments." "Shared implies agreement," I said. "I was never asked, only expected." That gave her pause, but only for a moment. "Daniel told me you found some paperwork," she said carefully. "About Maple Hills." I didn't respond. Her eyes flickered. Relief that I didn't deny it. Annoyance that I didn't take the bait to argue. She clasped her hands. "You misunderstood. It was exploratory. We're concerned about your safety. You live alone. You forget things." I raised an eyebrow. "What have I forgotten?" She hesitated. That was the problem with rehearsed speeches. They crumble when the audience doesn't play their part. "Well," she said, "little things. Daniel mentioned the time you left the stove on." "I turned it off 5 minutes later," I said. "I remember, because the smoke alarm chose that day to remind me of its existence." She flushed, but pushed forward. "We just want what's best for you." I met her gaze. "Then perhaps you should have included me in the conversation about my future." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her composure slipped, just slightly. A crack in polished porcelain. "You don't understand how much pressure we're under," she said, softer now. "Daniel's job is unstable. Clara's tuition is expensive. The house repairs never end. We've been carrying everything for years." Years, as though I hadn't carried them far longer. "You've had our help," she added. "Support. We've been there for you." The quiet in the room deepened, pressing at the edges of her words. "What help?" I asked. Not angry, simply curious. "Well, holidays, rides when you needed them, picking up groceries at times." "Groceries I paid for," I reminded her gently. She stiffened. "That's not the point." But it was. It always had been. I watched her sit there, struggling to assemble a justification that fit neatly into the narrative she carried. A narrative where I was aging, fragile, dependent. Where their decisions for me were kindnesses. Where my compliance was gratitude. "It would have been easier," she said suddenly, "if you'd just told us you were feeling insecure." "Insecure," I repeated softly. "No, I'm not insecure. I'm simply no longer willing to be unseen." That unsettled her more than anything else I'd said. She looked down at her hands, then back at me. "So, what now?" she asked. "Now," I said, "I will make my decisions, and you will make yours." She stood abruptly, collecting her purse. "Daniel won't like this." "Daniel," I replied, "will have to learn to live with things he doesn't like." She moved toward the door, stiff and silent. At the threshold, she turned, as if expecting me to soften, to offer her the reassurance she'd always taken for granted. I didn't. She left without another word. The house grew quiet again, not hollow, not tense, just quiet. A quiet that felt honest, even necessary. I sat back at the kitchen table, letting the stillness settle around me like a blanket. A soft, steady kind of solitude. one I chose. Clara showed up just after 5. I heard her footsteps on the porch, lighter than Sophie's, quicker than Daniel's. And when I opened the door, she stood there with her backpack still slung over one shoulder, cheeks pink from the cold. "Grandma?" she said, breathless. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. She walked straight to the kitchen, dropping her backpack by the chair she always chose. She looked around the room the way children do when they're checking that the world hasn't shifted more than they'd feared. "I heard Mom and Dad arguing," she said quietly. "About you." I set a cup of tea in front of her, though I knew she wouldn't drink it. Her hands were trembling, not from cold. She was young enough that weather didn't rattle her bones, but from confusion, worry, that fragile in-between space where a child begins to see her parents clearly for the first time. "What did they say?" I asked, sitting down. She pressed her palms together. "Mom said you're being unreasonable. Dad said you're acting out of spite." Her face tightened on the word. "They said you're making things harder than they need to be." I let the words drift between us for a moment. I didn't want them to sting her, though they hadn't stung me. Not anymore. "And what do you think?" I asked. She looked at me then, truly looked, eyes wide and bright and wounded by the world she was trying to understand. "I think," she whispered, "they're scared, and when they get scared, they pretend they're in charge." A small smile tugged at my mouth. "You're a perceptive girl." She nodded, then hesitated. "Grandma, are you really okay? I mean, truly okay? I don't care about the money stuff. I care about you." Her voice wavered in a way Daniel's never had. His concern, when it appeared at all, came coated in his own needs. Clara's concern came bare. I reached across the table and rested my hand lightly over hers. "I'm all right, sweetheart. Better than I was a week ago." "I don't want them to make decisions for you," she said suddenly, fiercely. "You're not—" She stopped, struggling to find the right words. "You're not someone who needs to be taken somewhere." The ache that rose in me wasn't sadness. It was gratitude, surprising in its warmth. "I know who I am," I said softly. "And now they know that I know." She relaxed a little, shoulders dropping. "Good." We sat in silence for a while. Outside, the wind rattled the last dry leaves against the pavement. Clara traced her fingertip along the rim of the cup, circling it over and over. "I'm scared they'll be mad at me," she said finally, "for telling you what I heard." I squeezed her hand gently. "Telling the truth is not betrayal. They won't see it that way." "No," I said. "They won't. But that is not your burden to carry." She swallowed, her eyes shining. "I don't want anything to happen to you." "Nothing is happening to me," I said. "Things are simply being rearranged." She took a shaky breath. "Dad said you're cutting us off." "I'm not cutting you off," I said. "I'm establishing boundaries. That's different." "But they're angry." "Yes," I said. "People often get angry when the rules they wrote stop applying." She looked down at her hands, and for the first time since she arrived, she seemed very young to me. 16 is an age where truth comes as sharply as adulthood, but without its armor. "I wish they understood you the way I do," she said. I brushed a stray curl from her forehead. "Perhaps one day they will." "Understanding often arrives late." She let out a small laugh, soft and sad. "I hate when they talk about you like you're fragile." "I am aging," I said, "but I am not breakable." She nodded slowly. "I know." We talked a little more, about school, about the art contest she wanted to enter, about her friend Lily, who'd just gotten her heart broken for the first time and was convinced she'd never love again. Ordinary things. Gentle things. When she stood to leave, she hugged me tightly, her arms wrapped around my shoulders with a sincerity adults often forget how to give. "I'm on your side," she whispered. "I know, darling." She pulled back, eyes bright, and managed a small smile before slipping out into the cold evening. I watched her walk down the porch steps, shoulders squared, chin lifted slightly. A child, yes, but one who had inherited something from me after all. A quiet kind of strength. Daniel and Sophie invited me to dinner 2 nights later. The message came through Clara. Of course it did. They knew I wouldn't ignore her. She said they just wanted to talk, which usually meant they wanted to convince, correct, or contain. Still, I agreed. Not out of obligation, but because silence only protects people who hope never to be held accountable. Their house was warm when I entered, warmer than necessary, as if they'd tried to make the air itself welcoming enough to undo the past week. The table was set too neatly. Sophie stood by the stove stirring a pot with exaggerated calm. Daniel hovered by the doorway, hands in his pockets. "Mom," he said, nodding. "Thanks for coming." "I wasn't far," I replied. My voice sounded steady, even to me. We sat. No one spoke at first. The clink of silverware felt louder than it should have. Sophie served pasta, everyone's safe dish, and folded her hands too delicately afterward, like a woman waiting for a performance to begin. Daniel cleared his throat. "Look, Mom, things have been tense. We know that, and we want to straighten everything out." Straighten. A tidy word for a messy truth. "I'm listening," I said. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "We think you overreacted. The transfers, the changes. You blindsided us. If something was wrong, you could have just talked to us." "What was wrong?" I answered gently. "Was the belief that I owed silent compliance." Sophie stiffened. "No one expected compliance. We expected communication." "Communication," I repeated. "Like the kind you had when discussing Maple Hills?" Her cheeks flushed. "That was preliminary. We hadn't decided anything." "You had filled out intake forms," I said. "That goes a bit beyond preliminary." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "Mom, we were worried." "Worry," I said softly, "is not a license to take over someone's life." He looked at me, then really looked. "We just wanted to be prepared. You're alone. What if something happened?" "I would have told you," I said. "But you planned instead of asking. You assumed instead of speaking. And you expected me to accept it because I'm older." Sophie's voice tightened. "We weren't trying to hurt you." "But you did," I said. "Not by planning a place for me, but by removing me from the planning." They both fell quiet. For a moment, I saw them not as antagonists, but as two people overwhelmed by their own fears, stretching themselves thin, grasping for control where they thought they had a right. Fear makes children of us all, but fear does not excuse disrespect. "I'm not here to punish you," I said. "I'm here to remind you that I am still here. I'm still capable, and I still decide my own life." Daniel swallowed. "So where do we go from here?" "Forward," I said. "But differently. With boundaries. With honesty. And with the understanding that my choices are mine." He nodded slowly, reluctantly, but not angrily. More like a man adjusting to a new pair of shoes he hadn't wanted, but now had no choice but to walk in. Sophie looked down at her plate. "We just Didn't expect this version of you. I met her gaze. This version has always been here. You just didn't notice. Dinner ended quietly. Not peacefully, not warmly. Quietly. As we stood to leave the table, Daniel put a hesitant hand on my shoulder, a touch that seemed to ask permission rather than forgiveness. I allowed it. Outside, the night was cold, the air crisp. I walked to the car Clara had driven, listening to the soft crunch of snow beneath my shoes. Some conversations don't fix things. They simply clear the ground so truth can stand. Daniel called the next morning, though his voice carried a different shape than before. Less anger, more calculation. I could hear it immediately. The tone people use when they're trying to regain ground they've lost, trying to steer a conversation back into familiar territory. "Mom," he said, "can we talk again? Just for a few minutes." He didn't wait for me to agree. He simply arrived half an hour later, knocking softly, as if volume could soften intent. When I opened the door, he stood there with his hands in his coat pockets, shoulders hunched, not from cold, but from uncertainty. "Morning," he murmured. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. He entered slowly this time, looking around the house the way a visitor might, not a son. He noticed the box still on the kitchen table, but said nothing. We sat. He rubbed his palms together once, then folded them. A habit left over from childhood, gathering courage, rehearsing words. "Mom," he began, "I've been thinking about everything you said." "That's good," I replied. He swallowed. "And I need you to understand our side too." I nodded for him to continue. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "We weren't trying to take control of your life. We were trying to prepare for the future. You've always been the one who handled everything. You made things easy, and maybe we got used to that. But it wasn't malicious." Malicious. Another word that missed the point. "I never accused you of malice," I said. "Only disregard." He winced, subtle but clear. "I guess I didn't realize how things looked from your perspective." "That," I said softly, "has been the problem for a long time." He exhaled and tried again. "Mom, you've always been independent, strong, but you're still older now. We were worried about you." I didn't bother challenging the obvious. Age is not a crime. The crime is when people use it as permission. "Daniel," I said, "I appreciate concern, truly. But concern is an invitation to conversation, not a justification for secrecy." He nodded, though reluctantly. Silence stretched between us, long but not hostile. Then, as if he couldn't help himself, the real reason for his visit surfaced. "The cancellations," he said quietly. "They've put us in a difficult spot. We're behind on several things. If you could reinstate just a few of the transfers, for now, it would help stabilize everything until we regroup." There it was. Not hatred, not cruelty, dependency masquerading as entitlement. I looked at him steadily. "No." He stared at me, confusion flickering into disbelief. "Just until we get sorted out." "No," I repeated, calm as breath. "You've built your life around money that wasn't guaranteed. Now you must build differently." His jaw tightened, not in anger this time, but in a grief he didn't know how to name. "We're your family," he said softly, almost pleading. "I know," I replied. "And I love you, but love cannot be used as collateral." He sat back, defeated. Not dramatically, quietly, the way a man sits when he realizes persistence will not change the shape of someone else's resolve. After a long moment, he spoke again, voice low. "I never wanted things to feel like this between us. Neither did I said. But wanting doesn't erase truth. He nodded slowly, eyes on his hands. The silence that followed wasn't sharp. It wasn't warm either. It was the kind of silence that comes when people finally put down what they've been dragging. After a minute, he rose. I should go. I stood as well. He hesitated near the door, as though waiting for softness, for surrender, for something familiar. I gave him none of it, only honesty. Daniel, I said gently, you are capable of standing on your own feet. I raised you that way. It's time you remember. He closed his eyes briefly, then nodded without argument. Okay, he whispered. I watched him walk down the path, shoulders heavy, steps slow. Not defeated, just confronted with a version of me he'd never bothered to imagine. And the morning, quiet and pale, settled around the house like a truth at last spoken. I didn't expect the house to feel different after Daniel left, but it did. Not brighter, not warmer, just mine again, in a way I hadn't felt in years. I moved quietly through the rooms, touching things the way one touches furniture after rearranging it. The same, but not the same at all. When morning came, the light slanted across the living room floor in a soft, wintry sheet. I stood there barefoot, letting the cold from the wood seep into my skin. I used to dread that feeling. Today, it felt honest. Age settles into the body the way snow settles onto earth. Slowly, without asking permission, but not without beauty. By noon, I found myself doing something unexpected, looking at listings for small rental cottages outside town. It wasn't that I planned to move soon, but curiosity had a quiet persistence to it. What would it be like to choose a home not based on anyone else's convenience? A place shaped around peace instead of obligation. I clicked through photos, simple rooms, wide porches, clean lines, and felt something stir in me. Possibility. Not the urgent kind, but the kind that grows slowly, like moss on stone. Later that afternoon, Clara came by. She didn't knock this time. She opened the door the way she used to when she was smaller, carefully, tentatively, as if checking whether she was entering a dream. "Grandma," she called, dropping her bag on the chair. "Are you busy?" "Never too busy for you," I said. She sat across from me, pulling her knees up the way she always did when her thoughts were heavier than she wanted to admit. "Dad's been quiet. Mom, too. It's weird. The house feels tense." "I imagine it does," I said. Change rarely arrives politely. She looked at me with that steady, searching gaze. "Are you okay with all of this?" "Yes," I said. "More than okay, really." She nodded slowly, watching me. "You look lighter." I smiled. Maybe I am. Clara swung her legs down and leaned her elbows on the table. "I wanted to ask something. Last night, when Mom said you were being stubborn, I told her she was wrong. I said you were being strong." She hesitated. "Was that okay?" "That was truthful," I said. "Truth is always okay." Her shoulders relaxed, and a small smile flickered across her face. "Good." We talked a little, about her classes, about a trip her art teacher was planning, about how she'd started sketching hands because she liked the lines and shadows. I listened, letting her voice fill the house the way warm air fills a room after the door has been closed against winter's draft. When she finished describing a painting she wanted to try, she looked around. "This house suits you," she said. "It feels steady." "It has been," I said. "But sometimes even steady things change." She tilted her head. "Are you thinking of moving?" "I'm thinking," I said gently. "Just thinking. She nodded, not pressing, not panicking, just understanding. The kind of understanding that doesn't require explanation. When she left, the house settled into its soft quiet again. I made myself tea and carried it to the window. Outside, a thin layer of frost coated the garden. The lavender bushes, brittle now, still held their shape. Even in winter, some things refused to collapse. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and let the steam rise toward my face. There was no drama left in the air, no urgency pulling at me. Only clarity, simple and clean. Daniel and Sophie were adjusting, slowly, reluctantly. But they were adjusting. Clara was steady. And I felt something I hadn't in a very long time. Room. Space. A future that belonged to no one but me. The tea cooled in my hands as daylight thinned, and for the first time in years, I felt wholly, quietly free. Winter loosened its grip slowly that year. The snow receded in thin, uneven lines, as if the season itself were unsure whether to stay or surrender. I felt something similar in myself, an easing, a quieting, a drawing back from the edges of fear I hadn't even realized I'd lived inside. Not fear of being alone. I'd grown used to that. Fear of being erased, dismissed, tucked away like old linens in a drawer. One evening, near the end of January, I brewed a pot of peppermint tea and settled into the armchair. The house felt soft around me, shaped by the silence of someone who no longer waits for footsteps that never come. Outside, the last of the frost clung to the railing, sparkling faintly in the porch light. The doorbell rang. I knew it was Daniel before I reached the hallway. Not from the sound, but from the rhythm of his presence. Something I had recognized since he was small. When I opened the door, he stood there with his coat unzipped, hair mussed by the cold wind. He looked older, years older than the last time I'd seen him, though only days had passed. "Mom," he said, and the word carried none of its usual armor. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside. He entered quietly this time, as if the house itself required gentleness. We sat at the table. He looked at his hands for a long time before speaking. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, "about everything, about how I've treated you, how we've treated you." I waited, not impatiently, just openly. "I didn't realize how much we relied on you, or maybe I didn't want to realize it. You made things easy, and I let myself believe that meant you didn't mind." His voice cracked. "But I see now that I took advantage of that. I didn't mean to hurt you. I swear I didn't." "I know," I said, "but intention doesn't erase impact." He nodded slowly. His throat worked as he swallowed. "I'm sorry. Truly." It wasn't grand. It wasn't polished. It wasn't the dramatic apology younger people imagine. It was something quieter, heavier, more adult. A man recognizing the shape of his own failings. "I want to do better," he said. "Not because you withdrew support, but because I should have understood sooner." I studied his face, the lines around his eyes, the small tremor in his fingers, the vulnerability he was trying not to hide. "Then do better," I said, "with honesty, with clarity, and with the understanding that I'm not a problem to solve, Daniel. I'm a person. Still." He nodded again, and this time his eyes shone. "I know. I truly do." We sat quietly after that. No need to fill the space with reassurances. Some truths simply rest where they land. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated by the door. "If you ever need anything, truly need anything, I'll be here. Not because I expect something back, just because you're my mother." "That," I said softly, "is enough." He gave a small nod. the kind that comes from humility, not defeat. Then stepped into the cold night, shoulders straighter than I'd seen in years. I watched him go, not with longing, not with regret, with something gentler, acceptance. Later, when the house settled again into its quiet, I walked to the window. The garden, still asleep beneath patches of frost, held the promise of spring. Renewal doesn't shout, it whispers. It begins slowly, beneath the surface, gathering strength long before anyone notices. So do women like me. At 74, I finally understood something my husband had known long before I did. Dignity isn't granted by others. It is claimed, quietly, in the choices we make when no one is watching. I sat down with my tea, letting the steam warm my face, feeling the deep, steady rhythm of my own breath. If someone were listening, really listening, I would tell her this. You are allowed to reclaim your life. You are allowed to draw a line. You are allowed to choose yourself, quietly, firmly, without apology. And if your voice shakes when you begin anyway. That is how dignity grows back. One brave, quiet choice at a time.